So welcome everybody to the third of this TEPoP event series that we're holding throughout the autumn this year. So I just wanted to set a bit of context before handing over to Michael and Alison. So the UKTEPoP is the UK Terrestrial Evidence Partnership of Partnerships. So this is a group of organisations who are seeking to collaborate on terrestrial biodiversity monitoring. The underlying principle of the partnership is one of collaboration and knowledge exchange. And the benefit that we hope will come from this is one of efficient and effective joint working. So each year we hold this series of online events to discuss topics of mutual interest, and these events are recorded and added to the JNCC YouTube channel for everyone who's unable to attend but interested in catching up on what's been going on. And you can see past events from previous years on the JNCC YouTube channel, and all the recordings from this year's event will be added there too. We also do sort of write-ups from events, and these can be found on the JNCC web pages. So this event today is the third event in this year's series, and thanks to Michael and Alison for arranging it. So if you want to catch up on updates from across TEPoP partners, and particularly on Brevi, the recordings for the previous two events will be up online soon. And if you want to join us for discussing sort of strategic discussions around TEPoP, particularly focusing on the terrestrial surveillance development and analysis partnership and on equality, diversity and inclusion, then we've got two more events that might be of interest for you to join over the next few weeks. So hopefully see lots of you there. So that's all I really wanted to say, just to set the scene as to what's going on today. And I wanted to pass back over to Michael Pocock from UKCEH to introduce us to what's going on with today's event. Thanks very much, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Nikki. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Someone will give me a wave if you can't, otherwise I'll carry on. So this is going to be a session in two parts, and the first part is going to be talking about precision citizen science. I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we've been doing with UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology with partners. There's going to be the opportunity to ask questions at the end of that. And then the second part is going to be taking that on, and in particular thinking about this value of model data. Thinking about local to national scales, and that's going to be the chance where we're going to introduce some of these topics and concepts, and then you'll have the chance to go into discussion groups, and that's where hopefully some great discussion and some great work will be done. We've chosen not to have a break, a formal break within this, given that it's only 2 hours. So hopefully you have got your coffee, but if you haven't and you need to go away, then of course you can. So we wanted to think then about getting the right data from the right places and the tools to support what could be called precision citizen science. So citizen science is a crucial part of environmental monitoring. It complements the data that comes from professionals, from sensors and from remote sensing. And this, I think, has been really clear within things like the Natural Capital Ecosystem Assessment, where citizen science has been one of the crucial legs in terms of the evidence base for thinking about environmental monitoring, in that case in England. And there are similar agendas in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Citizen science is really beneficial because it benefits science. We can think about assessing the state of nature through citizen science data. It benefits people, so those people getting involved. And so at UKCH, we've been doing some work over the past couple of years, looking at the benefits for nature connectedness and well-being for those people involved. And so there can be this really mutually beneficial interaction between the participants and those who want to use the data. And it also connects with pro-environmental behaviours and the evidence base needed for action for nature. So citizen science is really great. Citizen science data are collected in a wide range of different ways. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this sort of way of thinking about citizen science. So you've got the structured monitoring. There are a few well-known schemes: UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, Plant Monitoring Scheme, Breeding Bird Survey, things like that, where people revisit specific sites, they follow a protocol, and they gather data on abundance or relative abundance. If you go completely the other way, you get what can be called unstructured recording. People record what they want when they want. Through tools such as iRecord, we can get in excess of 1 million records, biodiversity records, a year. And of course, this has been going on for a long time, supported by the Biological Records Centre and various other organisations and agencies, both at local and national scales. And David Roy talked about this in the last TEPoP seminar. In between, you've got this semi-structured recording. This is increasing, I think, in profile recently. It's where you follow a protocol, so you do something set, but you actually participate where and to some degree when you want to. So you get some of the benefits of a structured protocol, but you also get the benefits of people being able to take part when and where they want. So with these structured and semi-structured projects, you can take part where you choose, and that's great. But that leads to this spatial variation, and that's both at large scales and at small scales. So we all know this: you get fewer records from things like iRecord and various others in isolated places up in Scotland and all the rest. You get many more records where people live, so down in the southeast, places which are really accessible to people. But you also get this at small scale. You get, in this case, this is butterfly records from part of Buckinghamshire. And you can see you get more records from nearest the edge of this small town, fewer records right out in the countryside. We know that we get more records in nature reserves and places like that. So that's fine, but that can be challenging. We can cope with that to a degree with analysis. But it does mean that all records are valuable, yes, certainly once they're verified and they've been verified to be used for scientific research. But I would argue, maybe provoke people in saying that we don't simply need more records. Actually, what we need is more informative records. So I'm now going to talk about two projects targeting revisits maps and DECIDE. And I should have said at the beginning that if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand once we get to the end of the talk. So talking first about the targeting revisits map. This is based on a fairly simple premise that with the trend modelling that we do within the Biological Records Centre for the unstructured data, we use data from 1 kilometre squares which have been visited in more than 1 year. So if there's a square which has been visited in only 1 year in the past, that means that if somebody revisits that square and records that species from that taxonomic group within that square, then they add real value to the data set, because you add both the historic data and the current data to the data set for trend analysis. So we visualize that really simply, and this is work I did with Colin Harrower at Biological Records Centre at UKTEPoP. And so we visualized it very simply, and we tried to make the triggers for people to respond to this really strong. So the simple ask was, can you make the pink squares green? So these places where we've only had records in 1 year, if you go there again, make records in iRecord, it will all get updated in real time, and that square will turn green. So there's a really strong incentive, almost a competitiveness, to get involved in doing that. We also set it up so that you can actually see information about the species which were recorded in that square in the past. And we've had really good feedback from this. And this quote here is from some of the feedback. So this person said that being able to see how impactful my recording can be and directing me to where recording could have greatest impact is immensely powerful and motivating. I'm definitely more likely to make an active effort to record species where I can see the outputs like this coming from the data I've submitted. So this person says two really key things. One is about they're able to see the impact of their recording. And the second is they're being directed to the places where the recording could have greatest impact. So we asked people, and these are just preliminary results from a small number of people so far. We said, so targeting revisits maps, you've explored it, will it influence your recording? And most people said, yes, very likely it will. So then we said, well, how much of your recording will it influence? And you can see that people generally said it will influence some of their recording. And so we then said, well, how is it going to influence your recording? And you can see that people are really motivated to visit those pink squares, those targets for revisits. It was interesting because we didn't highlight the fact that there are loads of gaps in those maps as well. The places which are blank were currently unrecorded, but people also felt really motivated to fill the gaps in those places, to fill in those blank squares. And you can see that actually there wasn't particularly any effect for those people visiting well recorded squares, and that's to be expected because those will be well recorded because they're people's local patches or their nature reserves where they want to visit anyway. So that's not surprising, but it really demonstrates the potential of this more targeted precision approach to supporting recorders. So now talking about the DECIDE project, this was a much bigger project. It was a multidisciplinary team, and I think that was a real strength of the project. So we brought in expertise from ecology and statistics and data science, but also from social science as well, and being able to blend all these different expertise from a wide range of different institutes, as you can see here. The second key thing about DECIDE, which I think made it really impactful and successful, to my opinion at least, is that co-design was right at the heart of the project. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The key thing about DECIDE was, though, that observers make records, so that goes to become digital data. We can use the digital data to model in this case, the distributions of species. We looked at 800 species of butterfly and macro moth. The information from the models can then be fed back to the observers. And as we saw with the targeting revisits map, that can affect the recorder's behavior. And you get this virtuous cycle, this loop where observers are incentivized based on the use of the data that they submit. So what's the need? Well, the issue is that we have good information on these large scale trends for reporting. We use data for trends in butterflies or moths or hoverflies, whatever it might be. We've got that. We also have at least relatively good information for some sites on the species that occur there. So nature reserves are fairly well recorded, and so that's using raw data. But when we spoke with people, we discovered that data users were saying, well, actually, they lack comprehensive fine-scale maps of things like biodiversity for use in natural capital to inform their decision making. And this is at the sort of regional scale, so larger than an individual site, but smaller than trends across the whole country. And recorders were saying, actually, we lack these tools to help guide our recording. We want our recording to matter more. And so you get maps like this dot map this is a smooth newt in London. And what do the gaps mean? Do the gaps mean that they've been visited and newts haven't been seen, or they haven't been visited? And even if we look at, certainly if we look at a 10-kilometre square, even if we look at a 1-kilometre square, there's actually a lot of variation going on in there. So there might be a newt occurring in that 1-kilometre square, but actually where that newt occurs is valuable information as well. So we started off by having in-depth interviews with recorders. And what we found was broadly, they were interested in making their recording count. So they had this willingness to be nudged. They also had great trust in the people who might be asking them to record in a particular place. So it suggests that they've got a capacity to be nudged. However, they also said that they've got their intrinsic motivations to record. They want to connect with nature in places that they enjoy. They've got a sense of place, which is important to them. So that suggests that there might be some resistance to being nudged to go this place or the other. So that means that we need tools for persuasive communication. And so through the Decide project, we developed these. We thought about this from the principle that we want these tools to provide information that's relevant, accessible, actionable, and appealing. And so this really guided our design for how we presented the information to people. And we also did this through a process of co-design. Typically, in the past, I would approach co-design by coming up with what I thought was the perfect solution, or working with developers to come up with the perfect solution, and then present it to recorders or volunteers or whoever, and then get a little bit miffed if they didn't absolutely love it, which clearly isn't really co-design at all. Instead, in this particular project, we used this fail fast design approach. And so we had a wide range of different techniques to gain feedback from people. So we used walkthrough interviews, we used focus groups, we used feedback via forms from the public after soft launch. And we did this through rapid iterations of the tool. So credit to Rich Birkmar at UKCH, who was able to very rapidly iterate this tool from a wireframe to a prototype through developing this prototype on the basis of feedback that we got. So what information did we put in this tool? Well, we were basing it on model distributions of species. So for these, we take a wide range of covariates, climate, habitat, data from Earth observation. And we combine that with citizen science presence data, or to a degree presence pseudo-absence data for these 800 species. And the output that we got was twofold. Firstly, we got the predicted distribution, and that in a sense is what we're after, what we really want. But associated with that was uncertainty. And so basically what we said was, or what we thought about in this project was, the places where there's greatest uncertainty suggests that more records can help improve our models. And so we looked within a particular region. In this case, it was 5 kilometers radius from a particular point on a map. And we were able to say, well, where are the models of species distribution least confident? And we stacked that uncertainty across all the different species. We then also looked at where the observations have been already made and said, okay, those are places which are well visited already, so we don't need to encourage people to go to those places. We said, well, the difference between those two are the places where it's best to collect new observations. And so we took all of that information and built that into the Decide tool. So the pitch for the Decide tool was, do you want to discover new places to record wildlife? If you do, then you can explore the Decide tool because it shows these places with high priority. You can choose a location to visit. And what we didn't do is tell people to, we didn't create a new recording tool. This is a tool to support recorders. We didn't want to add to the large number of successful recording tools already out there. We didn't want to insist that people had to record in a particular way. But we were able to update this map in real time from the data submitted in our iRecord. So the colours on the map show the recording priorities. You can click to get suggestions, and those pins will be based on places which are publicly accessible based on the information that we've got. You can click on any one of those pins or places in the map, and you can get more information about why that place is or isn't a recording priority based on the model's uncertainty, existing recording activity, and those sorts of things. You can, of course, explore that yourself. Secondly, Simon Rolfe, who's part of this workshop, led some work which was then saying, picking up that second part of the quote. If you remember, the person said, actually, seeing the impact of my records is really important. So we thought, let's give people personalized feedback. And this is partly based on the Decide tool so that we can encourage support and encourage people to use the Decide tool. But also it was able to give people information about the impact of their results. And so for the 800 or so people who signed up, we sent them weekly data stories about their butterfly recording. We designed these different data stories to appeal to different motivations. Some were more competitive, some were more collaborative, and all of them were personal to some, well, all but the control were personal to some degree. But some were really highly personalized. And so Simon and I and others are currently working through the results there to figure out exactly what this said, because we think that this is actually a really key opportunity to support recorders for the future. So we've got this idea of adaptive sampling, or precision citizen science, if you like. And we're interested now in the Decide project in exploring both how much it actually impacts people to record more, because we think that all of this feedback and all of this support for recorders could encourage people to record more, and also could encourage people to record in different places, to record in the places where recording most matters. And I'll come on to this result in a little bit more in just a moment. But one of the key things is that even if this adaptive sampling only encourages people to change 1% of their recording behavior, it still has an impact on the model outputs. So currently we're going through the process of evaluating the impacts of all of this. And in due course, I'll be able to tell you more about what the recorders thought of this, but certainly the feedback so far has been really positive. And so I will leave it there in terms of that presentation and invite any comments and questions, which Alison is going to chair for us.
Okay, so if you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can either, we have one question already in the chat, so you can ask the questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. So we have a question. So what's the ongoing resource requirement to support the personalized feedback?
That is a really good question. So with the Decide project, we set that up as effectively an experiment to explore all of this. And so there clearly will be an ongoing resource requirement to support this. That can be greater or less. And I think the best opportunity will be to build that into existing recording tools, such as iRecord, but others as well. And so that becomes part of the upkeep of those sorts of tools and part of the resourcing of those sorts of tools. But yeah, clearly there will be some resource requirements. The targeting revisits map is a much simpler approach, and that has been done actually with relatively little resource, effectively in the matter of days, to be able to support that and update that at the beginning of each year.
We have a hand from Oliver Grafton. Do you want to ask your question, Oliver?
Hi there. Thanks, Michael. That was really useful to hear and go through. So this work was done focused very much on butterfly recorders.
Yeah.
To what degree do you think that the lessons in this are universal? Are there limitations? Obviously, we have a lot of butterfly recorders. Will the same approaches work for the less recorded groups?
Yes, so with Decide, we intentionally worked with butterfly and moth recorders as well. So both daytime and nocturnal moths. And we did that intentionally because we wanted a large pool of recorders or potential potential. We wanted a large pool of people who potentially would engage with the tool. And so dealing with centipede recorders or something like that, clearly there's a much smaller pool of people to engage with. I think these principles are universal, and that's from looking at the results from the targeting revisits maps, which actually focused on taxa which are less recorded by fewer people. And it picked up very many of the same sorts of themes and questions. I'm not suggesting that the adaptive sampling or the personalized feedback is going to work for all recorders, not at all. Each recorder is going to be quite different. They will have their own motivations, but it does seem to be something that, yes, will have benefits across a wide range of taxa. And we're also actually exploring using it in different environmental domains as well, using these sorts of approaches. And so something like water quality monitoring, actually, the adaptive need for sampling may well be based more around time, recording now, rather than place, recording here.
So I think we have time for one more question, and there are actually two questions in the chat which are related to each other. So Karen Haysom asks, can you explain the difference between personal and personalized feedback, and were these automated stories? And Anna Robinson asks, are you assessing how personalized feedback impacts how well it went and how well it motivates continued recording?
Yes, yeah. So yes, we are assessing that, and Simon, I'm sure, will give me the nod. Yeah, we're looking at how it motivates people's continued recording, and then thinking about how best we can build that in. So I suppose the personal feedback was around what's going on in the location that you like recording in, or the region that you like recording in. So for me, it might be in South Oxfordshire, there have been this many records, and these are the places where records have been made. So it's personal to me. Personalized is then saying, here are your records in the context of the other recording that's gone on in South Oxfordshire. So it's adding that extra benefit. Yes, it was automated. Simon did a huge amount of work in order to get that automated, and I think it's got real potential. And there's a lot of, I'm really excited about this in terms of where we can take this for the future. I think it's got a lot of opportunities there.
Thanks for all of the questions. There are some that we haven't got to answering, some of which I think might be answered in the next bit of presentation around model data. Otherwise, we'll try and get to you in the chat and respond there. So yeah, time to move on, I think.
Okay, is that me again then, Alison?
It is.
Okay, right. So there we go. Deep breath. So this is now part 2 of where we are, spot on time, which is good. So we talked about all of this in terms of the precision citizen science, how we direct people to record in different places, or, well, not direct, how we invite people to record in different places. And I should emphasize that it really is, it's an invitation which people can accept or not accept, and it doesn't matter. And we still get the benefit of people recording where and when they want anyway. One of the things about Decide was that we were basing this on model data. So we were using those range of different covariates in order to create these surfaces and provide those nudges or those encouragements to people to record in different places. But one of the key things that we thought about model data was, as I introduced at the beginning, there are different needs for data users have different needs for the sorts of biodiversity and actually more broadly environmental data that we're able to collect. And so with Decide, we recognized that there was the potential to create these models, these model outputs, and how they could be used and where we could go with them, we felt was a really important question. So that's going to be for all that we discuss over the rest of this session. So you'll remember I'm sure you'll remember because it was only 20 minutes ago, I was talking about some of the issues with the raw data, and raw data, dot maps, things like that are great. We've relied on them, or we've used them a lot over the past 50, 60 years, ever since the plant atlas back in the 50s, really crucial sources of information. Oh, I'm just hearing a little bit of feedback. I think that's gone now. And it's great for well-recorded sites. That's brilliant. And for proving presence, it's also superb. But as we said, they're incomplete, and actually they're not very fine scale. The issue is that there are 11,000 10-kilometre squares in the UK. So actually, for a well-recorded taxa like birds or butterflies or things like that, it's possible to get reasonable coverage across those 11,000 10-kilometre squares. If we bring it down to the level of a hectare, so 100 by 100 meters, there are 250,000 hectares in Britain. So clearly we can't be getting presence records for all taxa for all of those squares. The benefits of raw data then, as I said, is proving presence. When you're looking at things like planning developments or various things like this, actually is that data of presences which are crucial. But the limitations are these sampling biases, reporting biases as well. So it could be that the species was present but just not seen, and at high resolution is incomplete. So a couple of examples here. You can see the 10-kilometre map of Maiden's Blush, a moth from the Atlas of the Britain and Ireland's larger moths from the butterfly conservation data sets. And you can see then, you can begin to see large scale patterns in terms of the fact that it appears to have retreated in the 70s, but is expanding in the Midlands since 2000. But you can also see from the Brown Argus map here from the MBN Atlas, you can see that as soon as you go to fine scale data, it's getting more patchy than the coarse scale data. Part of that will be a true reflection of habitat, and part of that will be observer coverage. So thinking about the model data, great thing about using models, statistical models, is that we can take account of sampling and or reporting bias. It's well used for temporal trends. So this is from the butterfly monitoring scheme data. It's used for the DEFRA biodiversity headline indicators. We can also do this with occurrence data, so not just the count data, but the unstructured occurrence data. We can use this for producing indicators and trends over time. So that's brilliant. In the UK, at least, I think we've been less familiar for using spatial data for decision making quite so much. These spatial distribution models have been used a lot in research and in science, but less so for decision making. But in theory, at least, there's the potential for comprehensive and fine scale coverage. You can see here, eBird is an example of a project which has got millions of records, but has been using those records, not presenting them as raw data, but doing models from those data, and then being able to produce these amazing distribution maps at continental scales, but also at really fine scales, showing, for in this case, a Sprague's pipit and its migration from its summer to its winter quarters. So that's great, but the use of models is still limited by uneven sampling. It's because we can get, or we're limited potentially by varying quality of information. So we need to consider uncertainty. And also, of course, it requires good covariate data. I wanted to refer to some work which colleagues of mine at UKCEH have done, talking about the risk of bias in this model data. And what they did was they ran a wide range of different models. They did this in a range of different ways, as you can see here, using these ensemble approaches, running different models and then bringing them together, sort of averaging them. And then they used expert assessment to say, how well do these model distributions actually relate to an expert's assessment of what's known to be present? And what Rob Boyd, Ollie Pescott and others identified is that there are opportunities for high throughput species modelling, but we do need to ensure that the ranges and niches of the species have been sampled comprehensively or sufficiently comprehensively in order to support the models and avoid bias and excessive uncertainty. However, I presented this result earlier. There are benefits of targeted sampling, and I think their quote really shows that. So if we need comprehensive sampling across a species range, we need to know where it's most useful to go. And Thomas Mondet-Marval and Susan Jarvis at UKCH under the DECIDE project did some simulations. And what they showed is the models become more accurate as you fill gaps, basically. And if you do a simple gap filling, go to the places where we haven't got records, you get a small improvement in those spatial models. If you ask people to go to places based on something to do with uncertainty, so basically using more intelligent model-based methods to send people to those places or encourage people to go, you get a greater improvement. Actually, it doesn't really matter the precise details of how you do this in an intelligent way, as long as you do it in some sort of intelligent way. So it does raise the question of how good is good enough, and when are the models improved sufficiently enough. Those are all things which hopefully you can discuss within the discussion sessions. So we've got these existing species distribution models, which are the relationships of species with past environmental data, sort of the data that we've got so far. I think there's potential for these models to be improved. We explored this a bit within the DECIDE project and how we can use better remote sense data in order to improve those models. So rather than simply relying on things like habitat classifications from remote sense data, actually using the fine scale spectral information, effectively the colours from the satellites, to be able to tell us something, for example, about the quality of grassland or the quality of woodland, and using the species data to do that. So that's one opportunity I think that we've got for model data. And the second opportunity then is, as the remote sense data in this case gets updated and the habitat data gets updated, and potentially even over time climate data gets updated, we can predict then how species are going to change. And I think that's probably most important at the short term for thinking about interventions which we can put in place. So I suppose the question is if you had spatial biodiversity data and it was therefore modelled and it was sufficiently accurate for you, what would be made possible? What could you do with these model data that weren't otherwise possible? How could you use those for decision making? How could you use those for large scale or regional or local assessments? Could you use them for things like assessing biodiversity net gain, particularly if there's that live link, if you like, with the remote sense data as it's being updated, with some of the satellite data every 5 days or so, but certainly over the course of a year or two, it will be updated. Are these valuable to you? And so those are the sorts of questions which we would like you to go on and discuss. And so over to you, Alison.
Right. Hello. So I should also introduce myself. I'm Alison Dyke and I work for the Stockholm Environment Institute at the University of York. We have a little bit of time for questions again on the modelled data before we actually go into talking a bit more about how you might be able to use it. So does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask on that last little presentation? You can either stick them in the chat or raise your hand. I'm just scrolling down through the chat to see whether... okay, so we have one from Ben Deed who says, in the LCR, we have found that national/remote sense datasets can be very inaccurate when it comes to some habitats as a result of the authority commissioning updated UK habitat and condition assessments. Would it be possible to read in those data to this modelling? We could also then look at facilitating decide tools with local recorders. And he adds, I run the LERC for North Merseyside.
Yeah, I think, Ben, that partly depends on what you mean by the national or remote sense data sets. So clearly the remote sense data sets or the remote sense data themselves simply are the data. They're the images or the data of the colors, the multispectral data that comes from the satellites, and it's then what we do with it. And I think there is this massive challenge, which, talking to remote sensing scientists, remains a really big challenge to be able to translate that into habitats accurately that we recognize on the ground. And I think broadly they do a really good job. It's just that we really notice the relatively rare times that they get it wrong, these classifications get it wrong, and so we might focus, whether that's 2% or 5% or whatever, we say, well, no, that clearly isn't a wood, that's scrub, or no, that isn't grassland, that's something else. So I think that's worth bearing in mind, and it's when we scale up whether there's value or how much value there is in this at, for example, a regional level rather than simply at a site-based level. I think there is also opportunity in pulling together more and more different sources of information, for example, the on-the-ground surveys to help feedback. And I think those feedback loops are challenging to put in place, but also really, really valuable opportunities. So I hope that's answered your question.
Any more questions, or we can move on? Oh, we've got a hand from Sue Byrne. Do you want to ask your question, Sue?
Yeah, hi. If it's not going to take too long, do stop if it's too complicated, because this might be because I don't understand modelling and statistics well enough. But there was one of the slides in that set that showed the amount of improvement that you got in your uncertainty from different modelling approaches. And I didn't understand that slide. I don't know if you've got time to explain it. If you haven't, it's fine to move on.
Yeah, I purposefully removed the detail from the y-axis in that slide simply because it's quite a technical measure of model fit. And I think the next step will be going on to say, well, actually, okay, so that's a technical measure of model fit, but how much impact does it have for users like you? How much of an improvement does that represent for the uses to which you might put the data? Is that good enough? Is that nowhere near good enough? And so I hope that slightly deconfuses things for you, Sue.
Okay, that's fine for now. Maybe something for another time.
Yeah, it's the interaction. It's the interaction across the researchers and data users, I think, is really important to advance this area of science.
Yeah, thank you.
We have one more, which you may be able to answer quickly. Could you use variables derived from other countries to then model potential distribution of INNS in the UK, using this to help inform targeting for checking colonisation risks?
Yep, and for those not in the know, that's invasive non-native species is the INNS. And yeah, absolutely, Dylan. And then this sort of thing is, so that's the typical way in which species distribution models have been used in the past. So using data and those relationships from elsewhere and other countries, and then being able to say things like this. Other examples would be looking at threats of climate change. So being able to say, well, under future climates, this is what we might expect the species to do. What's been used, or what's been done less, I think, is being able to assess at this regional scale the shorter term impacts of, or at least the potential for habitat change as assessed through things like remote sensing to impact on species distributions. And that's where this cycle of adaptive sampling, I think, is really valuable, because both the species distribution data can help inform the models, but also the models can predict where the species might be, both in terms of where might it be good to go and look for those species, but also so where it might be good to go and look for those species, but also then how that feeds into regional assessments of change and the impact of change.
Okay, thank you. So there's some more questions appearing in the chat, but again, we'll try and get back to them as we have an opportunity to, or you might have the chance to try and answer some of those yourselves in the activity that we're going to do next. So we're now going into the part of the workshop, which is more interactive. And we're going to be using a concept board for our discussions. So I'm just going to share my screen now to introduce that to you. And show you how it all works before I ask you the first question. So I can see that some people have joined the concept board already, and we'll share the link in the chat. There are a few things that you'll need to know in order to be able to do the first activity, and then as we go into the breakout groups and have a bit more discussion. So first thing is that there's an arrow pointer up here, which you can use to select things. So that's how you would select things like sticky notes, which you will need in this first activity. So we're asking you to choose one sticky note to add a strength and one sticky note for a weakness of modelled data. If you want to move around the board, as you will need to do as we go into breakout groups and to work on a slightly different bit of the board, there's a hand symbol here. And if you click on that, you can use that to move the board around. But for the first activity that we'll be doing, we'll be staying with this area on the top left hand of the concept board. So those are the two main things for navigating around the board. On the activities that we're going to be doing, we have instructions, which are here down the left-hand side in green, and that carries on through the other activities that we'll be doing. And for this one, we'll be using sticky notes, which you can select here and place wherever you want, and then add text. Later on, we'll be using some slightly different features. So we'll be using little sticker dots, which you can place where you want, but the same principles apply. You select them using the pointer, and then you can move them to wherever you want. So I think that's probably everything that you need to know about the concept board. I'm going to keep my screen shared so that we can see your comments as you add them. Michael, would you be able to share the link for the concept board in the chat for me, please?
Yes, I've done that.
Okay, great. So let's see, have we got everybody in the room? Okay, I'm not sure we've got quite everyone yet, but the first activity that we want to do to try and start thinking about how you might use model data and how we can help to make that model data most useful to you is to just, from your perspective, think of one strength of model data and one weakness of model data. So you can grab yourself a post-it note from that menu at the top, pop it into either the strengths or the weaknesses box, and then add some text to say what that strength or weakness is. If you see issues which are similar to what you're thinking about, you can group your sticky note close to other similar ones. So I'm starting to see sticky notes appearing, which is promising. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that. Okay, so we've got lots of post-it notes appearing now, and some common themes starting to emerge, both in terms of strengths and weaknesses. In strengths, we've got quite a cluster around coverage and scope, being able to show distributions across spatial area and inaccessible areas, unsampled areas. Some more around enabling predictions from the data that you already have, so projecting out from that. And then under weaknesses, we have, there's quite a cluster around uncertainty and needing to have confidence in the data that has gone into creating the model to start with, and the fact that models are only as good as the data that's inputted in them to start with. There's another cluster around interpretation of model data and ensuring that people who are interpreting the model data understand what it is that's actually being shown in the outputs. Don't know whether there's anything else that you want to add there, Michael, in terms of what's coming out.
No, that's fine.
Okay, right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and turn to the main session. So in addition to the user interface, which was developed in the DECIDE project for recorders, Simon has been working on developing a user interface for data end users, so people who might actually want to use this model data that we've been developing in the project. So Michael's going to give us, apologies, Simon's going to give us a walkthrough now of that user interface to show us what you could potentially do with that user interface. And then we're going to go back into breakout groups to actually think about, having talked about some potential use cases that you could use this user interface and the model data for. We're going to go into breakout groups to discuss how we might develop the user interface around them. So Simon, would you like to just give us a walkthrough of the user interface now, please?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Hi, everyone. So my name's Simon. I'm a data scientist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And yeah, what I'm sharing now is, hopefully you can see the screen, is basically we want to kind of envisage what would be this minimum viable product for you to be able to access and interact with this model data at quite a large spatial scale. So what we've put together in this sort of demonstrated prototype is a tool with a map, of course, and you can select a certain region. So I've put in 5 counties as regions you can select from just as a default, but it could be anything from administrative areas to national parks to any of those sorts of functions. And you can see it's showing for this area at 100-meter resolution, in this case, butterfly diversity as a modeled output. And you can see the yellow indicates a higher species richness, and then the blue indicates a lower species richness. And in this interface, we've also included sort of circles indicating where there is data to kind of give you that cross-reference between the real data and the model output. And we're showing you this at a sort of aggregated species group level rather than at a species by species. And this is kind of what we'd envisage providing a first case, because the sort of modeling approaches we're doing, we're not tailoring them to a particular species. So actually how well they perform is better as a sort of when we're generally looking at a species group rather than individual species. So we've got the species richness layer, which is showing how sort of biodiversity. We can also provide the recording priority at a higher spatial level. So you can see we've got, you know, patches of where records, so yellow is indicating higher priority for recording, and blue is highlighting where there is less need for records. You can see where there are records, especially clusters of records, as indicated by the black circles. You can see it's kind of down weighted the priority, saying, you know, we don't need as much information from here because we've got records from here. And then this is also available for the different taxa that we've run models for in the DECIDE project. So butterflies, day flying moths, and night flying moths. And in terms of if any provided regions weren't suitable, you could upload shape files. So say you're interested in North York Moors, you could have your own shape file you can upload and be able to view that map of your area of interest. So you can work in wherever you're working, and then you can export. So you can download the data as a raster format, so it's like a grid-based information. And so for every 100-meter grid cell, you've got these three layers: the species richness and the DECIDE recording priority, and then also this final layer, which is just the model uncertainty before it's been down-weighted by the sort of recency of records. But yeah, the point of this was just to show you sort of what's possible and what we'd be looking forwards to in future development of these sorts of tools. What we've put together is, yeah, the minimum viable product. You can look at the data, you can look at the models, you can look at it for a particular region that you're interested in, and then you can download that data to then be able to use in whatever workflows you would be using for your use of the modeled outputs. And yeah, that's where we've got to so far.
We have a situation now where we have a really nice user interface for users to interact with the modeled data. And we have been taking a similar approach to the way that we were working with our data end users, our recorders, in terms of co-design. And what we've done is we've held a similar process of initially we had 39 interviews with data end users to establish their data needs. We've then held a series of workshops to establish working towards some purposes for working with model data. And we've also conducted a survey. So the point that we've got to at the moment is that we now have established from kind of common themes that were coming out from those workshops and the survey, 4 things that people might potentially want to use this kind of model data using this kind of user interface for. So we have 2 use cases which are more around needs which people can see coming in the near future in terms of relatively newly introduced legislation and ideas around that legislation. One on local nature recovery strategies and associated networks. And I'm sure you're familiar with this already, but local nature recovery strategies is an England-wide system of spatial strategies that will establish priorities and map proposals for specific actions to derive nature's recovery and provide wider environmental benefits. And those will be delivered in partnership by networks. The second use case which we've established is around biodiversity net gain, which again is a relatively new thing, which is still in a process of development in terms of how it will be delivered, where the aim is to leave a site in a measurably better state than prior to development. So that will require prior assessments of quality, projections of benefits and how that benefit will be derived, monitoring of change over time and evaluation as well. We then have two use cases which are more general and tend to be the kinds of uses that people can see in their work at the moment, in terms of the users that we have engaged with so far. So those two use cases are identifying areas of concern or interest. So using model data as a scoping tool to identify areas of concern or interest for more detailed assessment or intervention, and usually on a site-based basis. So that might be trying to identify areas where you have a significantly lower prediction of a species than you might expect, where you might want to take some kind of action to improve the quality of the habitat for a particular species or group of species. Or you might notice that there's what appears to be a gap in the data or a gap in the presence of a species which merits some further intervention. And the final use case is around projecting the impacts of interventions. So using model data to assess the knock-on impacts of management interventions on other species in addition to those being targeted. And the specific example that we were thinking about here was around insecticide treatments for invasive species. So we were thinking about oak processionary moth in particular, which is something that's where this example has come up, where there were going to be insecticide treatments to target an invasive species, but there would likely be knock-on impacts on other insect species as well. So potentially using model data to assess the impact of that intervention on other species, non-target species. So we have those four use cases which we've established so far from our co-design. However, there may be further use cases which might occur to you in the course of your work or be useful to you in your work, either in terms of the work that you do at the moment, like the second two use cases there, or in terms of things which you can see coming in the near future, which aren't possible to do at the moment, but you think might be a really good use of this kind of model data and this kind of user interface. So what we're going to do now is to go into some breakout groups where we can discuss these things in some more detail. So we have a total of 9 breakout groups, which have between 4 and 5 people in each one. So you can discuss these things in some more detail. We're going to be working on the concept board again, and we're going to move on from the area where we were working initially, and we'll move over to the right, where there are a set of panels which go down the board. So group 1 is at the top, and group 9 at the bottom. And I'd like you to work in your breakout groups on the panel, which shares a number with your breakout group. So when I open up those rooms, if you could take note of the room that you've been sent into, then you can find the panel that you need to work in. So with luck, the instructions for these activities that we're going to do in the breakout groups should be self-explanatory enough for you to work independently within the breakout groups. So we've got, again, as before, the instructions in green boxes down the left-hand side of each panel. And that asks you to do a number of tasks towards developing these use cases. So developing the use cases which we have identified already. And also, if you have other ideas about use cases that you could use this kind of model data for, you can develop those as well. So we're going to have about 35 minutes in our breakout rooms. And once you've gone into your breakout rooms, we have several floating facilitators who will be moving around between the rooms to help you out if you have questions that you want to ask. But I think we're at the point now where I can actually start the breakout rooms. So you'll see an invite asking you to move into a room. So I'm just checking what the numbers are in each group. I think that looks okay. So I'm going to open the rooms now. So there's a rough time indication in the boxes, instruction boxes, telling you roughly how much time to spend on each activity. But we'll send a broadcast message out to remind you to move on. So I'm going to open the rooms now, and either myself or Michael or Simon Rolfe or Emma Wright will pop into your rooms to check that all is well, and to help you out with any questions that you might need to ask. So right, I'll open the rooms now.